If you enjoy what you hear here today, please consider supporting me on my Patreon page. Every dollar helps, and you get to see content that you won't see here.
Chapter 21 Homecoming, Part 1. Silverquill's eyes squinted in irritation under the assault of the first morning light streaming through the open window, waking him up from a peaceful slumber. He moved his head away from the source of the irritation, but that didn't help. His eyelids fluttered, briefly revealing bloodshot and tired eyes, forcing him to squint in an effort to hide from the painfully bright light. Why are the windows open? Silver thought grumpily as he shivered in the morning chill. And where's the bloody blanket? He groaned and lifted his head, yawning tiredly as he slowly opened his eyes to find the source of his irritation. What he saw, however, struck him dumb. The translucent curtains of the window were thrown wide open, casting the library sitting room in a warm orange and yellow color scheme. Silver could feel the heat from the light slowly warming his body, only for the warmth to be wicked away by the chilliness of the morning, almost making him feel like he was bathing in water that was both hot and cold at the same time, cold on the outside and warm on the inside. The couch cushions were warm beneath his forelegs, the heat from his body having seeped into the material during the night. Silver found it strange that was the case. He much preferred to sleep on his side rather than on his stomach. Or at least, he would have found it strange if he hadn't been rendered nearly catatonic with surprise. Every detail about the room, both minor and major, were currently being completely ignored as his brain latched onto one detail that was much, much more important than any other. Even the fact that he was still wearing his Nightmare Night costume, the suit that Rarity had lent him, didn't register in his mind. Less than a few inches away from him lay the sleeping form of Twilight Sparkle, her chin resting on top of her crossed forelegs, her mane spilling over the side of her face like a blanket, swaying almost imperceptibly with the tide of her breathing. Silver went from bone-tired to completely awake in a matter of seconds. His heartbeat sped up as adrenaline flooded his body with wakefulness. Resisting the urge to make any sudden movements, Silver stared at the sleeping mare incredulously. What in the... he thought to himself, his mind a mess of conflicting images and feelings. It felt like he was trying to put an immensely complicated puzzle together, except his memories were the puzzle pieces and he only had a vague idea of what the completed puzzle was supposed to even look like. Frankly, Silver counted himself lucky that he hadn't started sputtering in surprise. He leaned forward slightly, getting a better look at the sleeping mare. Her mane was disheveled, he noticed, with little strands occasionally poking out, and there were bags under her eyes. But despite her unkempt appearance, Silver noticed that she wore the tiniest of content smiles in her sleep. The open window was behind her, Silver realized, the light spilling forth from the window hitting only a small portion of her body. Twilight murmured and pressed herself tighter against her forelegs, unconsciously looking for warmth with a small and fairly adorable whine. In a flash, it all came back to Silver. The night before had been filled with more emotion than any he could remember in a long, long time. And it was all because of this intelligent librarian. She had made him more nervous than when he had first tried to publish a book, and she had made him more happy than when he had read that first positive review. He remembered it like he did the rides at the Nightmare Night Fair, soaring highs and plummeting lows hitting him one after the other. The anxiety he felt about confessing his feelings so bluntly and openly, especially after having been so quiet and confused about them, something that left a dirty taste in his mouth, had nearly been enough to cause him to choke on his own tongue. That, coupled with the sheer joy of hearing her say those small, meaningful words back to him, a mere 3 syllables that carried the weight of a moon, made him more exhausted and happy than he'd ever felt in his entire life. His smile that he didn't even know he was wearing faded slightly as he remembered what he'd said about his past. His smile slowly shrank until it was replaced completely by a blank expression, the one that he normally wore before he had met Twilight and fallen for her. He breathed deeply, very aware of his own heart beating in his chest slightly faster than normal. For so many years now, he had refused to let his emotions overpower him, all because of a misunderstood promise he had made to that mare when she was but a colt. He had mourned, yes, but throughout the entire ordeal, even during her funeral, he hadn't shed a single tear of bereavement. He had stayed stoic, steadfast, and strong, because that was what she wanted him to do. To be strong. Silver's smile returned, a little bit more bittersweet this time. It was ironic, he thought, that such emotion should well up now of all times, when he was happier than he had ever been. You have to take the good with the bad, I suppose, he mused wryly. Just as he did so many times before, Silver stifled those feelings away under a cold, hard barrier. But not at the same time, he thought as he gazed at the sleeping mare who shivered slightly in the chill. The bad can wait until later. She said that she loves me. He felt his pulse quicken at the simple thought. And I... His smile became smaller, but no less happy as he beheld the librarian sleeping in her hooves, snuffling quietly as she lightly snored. He felt a somewhat familiar sensation of warmth flood through him, replacing all of the blood in his veins with glorious light. It was the same feeling that he had felt every time he had laid eyes on her before, only now, multiplied hundreds of times over. He leaned down and put his mouth next to her ear. I love you, he whispered, feeling a thrill pass through him as he did so. Her ear twitched at this, lightly flicking him on the nose as she murmured something unintelligible in the sleepy response. A silent laugh bubbled from Silver, and he had to resist the urge to nuzzle the mare. Instead, he slowly lowered his head down to rest on the cushions, his cheek mere inches away from hers. With a simple thought and a small burst of magical energy, Silver's horn lit up, drawing the curtains closed with a hiss of metal on metal. With another thought, and a little more power, Silver formulated another spell, one that made heat from magical energy, and shrouded himself and Twilight in an invisible blanket of warmth. It would only last for a little over an hour. Wasn't a self-sustaining spell, but it was useful in situations where one needed to warm their hooves but didn't have a blanket handy. Twilight sighed contently where she lay, snoozing into her forelegs. Silver emulated her position, smiling slightly as he closed his eyes and listened to the sound of her breathing until he fell back to sleep. A nudge on Silver's side woke him up once more.
Silver,
a soft voice said.
Wake up.
He merely squeezed his eyes shut and did nothing, too comfortable to move. Another nudge, slightly more forceful than the last.
Come on, Silver, you need to get up. The library's going to be open in an hour, and I can't have you sleeping on my couch.
Silver groaned and covered his eyes with his forelegs.
Just give me 5 minutes,
he mumbled.
Nuh-uh. You get off your lazy flank right now, mister, or I'll make you.
Silver resisted the urge to grin. He recognized that tone as the one Twilight used when she had to be a little bit more firm than usual when talking with Spike. He detected a hint of amusement in the authoritative tone. He didn't move, opting to stay right where he was on this delightfully comfortable couch, waiting to see if she was going to follow up on that threat or not.
All right, then. Don't say I didn't warn you,
Twilight said in a light, uncaring voice. Silver was about to reply, but was interrupted by the comfortable couch tipping over at a near 90-degree angle, sending him tumbling onto the floor in a heap of confusion and discomfort. Silver opened his eyes to see a lavender face looking down at him with a smirk. Next to them, The couch that was wrapped in a purple aura that was currently standing on only 2 legs slowly lowered back down and settled into its normal position on the floor. She grinned at him smugly. Silver merely groaned in response as he brought himself to his hooves.
What time is it?
He asked tiredly.
It's almost 11.
Twilight replied. He blinked. Oh.
It is late.
Yes, it is.
Twilight said, walking past him and flicking his nose with her tail playfully.
Thankfully, no ponies come in looking for any books yet. They're all probably still sleeping off all that candy from yesterday.
That was a sobering thought. It would have been rather embarrassing if some pony had walked in to see the 2 ponies lying sprawled on the sofa like they'd been. Not to mention they both had some freshening up to do. Silver ran a hoof through his straight mane and frowned. Oh, it was going to take him quite a while to get rid of this particular case of bedhead. He followed Twilight to the kitchen, where they made themselves a quick breakfast. Due to the lateness of the morning, and the fact that they hadn't eaten anything more substantial than candy and chocolate last night, they were both feeling ravenous. Sitting down at the table with their food, a bowl of oatmeal for Twilight and an omelet for Silver, they finally got some real food in them.
You know, I broke my streak because of you,
Twilight said, pointing an accusatory spoon in his direction and casting him a glare. Silver stared and looked at her in confusion.
Your what?
My streak,
she replied grumpily.
For the past 14 years, I've woken up at the exact same time, 7 sharp. Now all that effort has gone to waste.
She folded her forelegs and put her nose in the air, eyes closed in a picture of haughtiness.
I hope you're proud of yourself.
Silver blinked, unsure of what to say. He stopped himself as he noticed the corners of her mouth were turning upwards ever so slightly. I am, actually, he finished with a casual smile in her direction, causing her to make a scandalized face that he couldn't help but laugh at. When she realized that she had just been played, she laughed as well.
Well, I'll forgive you this time,
she said lightheartedly. Silver rolled his eyes and went back to eating. How thoughtful of you. Twilight nodded primly, satisfied that he recognized her benevolence and generosity. They ate in silence for a few minutes, occasionally glancing up at one another, smiling nervously and looking back down to their food without a word between them. They fidgeted, they looked around meaninglessly, they tapped their hooves on the tabletop restlessly, shooting glances back and forth at one another like a filly and a colt who had just met, but didn't know what to say to one another. Silver's mind went back to many years before, when he was still a little colt, and was walking the halls of his school with his nose buried in a book. He recalled bumping into the Lavender Filly, as she had been known to him then, and not being able to say a word to her, not even one of goodbye or hello. He had been so nervous, he remembered, every time he had seen her in the hallway between classes, or during recess, curled up with a book under the shade of an oak tree. She seemed so unapproachable then. In the halls, she was always pulled away by the busy rush of students before he could get near her, and during recess, her book might as well have been an impenetrable barrier with the words, "Go away," written on it. He'd only seen her for a short time, a few years probably, or the average amount of time that all unicorns spent in the lower grade level of magical education, before they switched to a school that was better suited to their abilities and talents. She didn't really seem particularly special or interesting to Silver. She was always reading and never talked to those around her, but something in his immature mind had seen something in her that he had never seen before. She was special, he just hadn't known why. Silver had been nearly overjoyed when he first saw that Lavender Filly and Celestia's School for Gifted Unicorns, something that surprised him rather greatly. Why should he be so happy about that, or feel such an unusual draw towards her? And why did it sting so badly when it turned out that she wasn't going to be learning there after all? Why had it been extra hard to go to sleep that night? Silver had quickly forgotten about her, though, as his schoolwork started to take precedence, soon followed by his mother's illness and passing. He'd had no more time to think about her, the friend that he had never made. A thought struck Silverquill, chilling him to the bone and rooting him to the chair. Was that all about to happen again? Silver came to the sudden realization that his stay in Ponyville wasn't permanent. In fact, it was likely going to end very soon, and he'd be going back to Canterlot sometime within the next few days. He had responsibilities there. His home, his books, his friend and family, not to mention his publisher, who would likely be on his flank like white on rice if he didn't hunker down and get back to writing as he normally did. And he was supposed to. The whole reason for this impromptu vacation, he remembered with a start, was to give him a break from the city life and knock him out of his creative dry spell. Luna had been right. This little sabbatical had been just what he needed. He could already feel the gears and cogs in his head loosening, his mind slowly whirring into life, ready to churn out page after page after page. He was going to have to leave soon. Go back home to the city where the air smelled of body odor and the ponies smelled of false sincerity and honeyed words. But more than that, he was going to have to leave Twilight. His breath hitched in his throat, and he felt his chest flutter at the mere thought. No, not this time, he thought. Twilight? She looked up from the table. I just realized that I'm gonna have to return to Canterlot soon. Her face transformed from content and serene to bewildered, her eyes widening and her jaw becoming slack. It seemed that he was not the only one who had forgotten the details of his stay. She quickly put on a mask of nonchalance, smiling pleasantly at him.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten about that,
she replied easily. Silver's years of gaining control over his emotions had made him hypersensitive to those of others. And right now, deep in Twilight's eyes, he could see brief flashes of sadness. Her smile quickly faltered, and she looked down at her oatmeal without another word. Funnily enough, it almost made him smile to see it. He swallowed instinctively. But I'm not sure I want to. Her ears twitched as she looked up with interest, hope shining through the sadness in her eyes. Silver took a deep breath and forced a calm expression. I meant what I said to you last night, Twilight, he stated, looking her dead in the eye. Every word. I'd rather cut my own hoof off than have to leave Ponyville right now. But unfortunately, I don't have much of a choice. However, he paused, thinking to himself. Twilight leaned forward, eager to hear what he had to say. I don't necessarily need to stay in Canterlot. She blinked, a small smile forming on her lips. Silver sighed, forgetting his hoot for a moment despite his hunger. I'll be completely honest with you, Twilight. I don't like Canterlot. I was born and raised there, but I always wanted to pack my bags and leave. He smiled. The only problem was that I never had any incentive to. Twilight nodded along silently. Well, I found one now. The opportunity to live close to the most wonderful, beautiful mare I've ever met is a very compelling one. Silver finished with a small grin, causing her to blush and look away. But before I do anything, I need to know something, he continued, his voice more serious this time. I need to know, in no uncertain terms, what you feel about me. Looking back at him quickly, Twilight's eyes widened considerably, and then softened in understanding. Silver felt his mouth go dry as his heart started to beat faster. He knew what she had told him yesterday, yes, but there was still that lingering, niggling feeling of doubt eating away at him inside. It would have been so easy for her to completely destroy him at this very moment. Because as calm as he may have seemed right now, in actuality he was on the verge of panicking. Questions and scenarios were running through his mind at the speed of thought, each one more horrifying than the last. What would he do if she didn't want to be around him? What if she was visibly repulsed by the idea? What if she was so angry at him for asking that she kicked him out of her library right that second? Now, rationally, Silver knew that these thoughts were at least slightly ridiculous, but he didn't think that he was entirely capable of being rational right now. She said ineffectively, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the words to say. She blinked, looking strained and confused in her silence. Silver felt his heart plummet rapidly.
I don't...
An iron hard will was the only thing that kept his face from falling, and from tears welling up in his eyes. He nodded solemnly, swallowing. I understand, he replied, not actually understanding at all. What had happened last night, then?
No!
She cried, waving her hooves out in front of her and almost knocking over her bowl.
No. It's not like that. I just...
Twilight sighed and hung her head. Mumbling to herself incoherently, she rubbed at her temples. Silver merely watched her. Finally, after a long moment of silence, Twilight looked up to meet his eye.
Okay, I'm not very good at these types of things. It was always Rarity's expertise, among other things, she said seriously. Nevertheless, I'm going to explain myself to the best of my limited ability.
Her serious, businesslike tone only worked to confuse Silverquill even further. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath through her nose, and began to speak.
I was always a fairly bookish pony. For no reason other than that's just how I was. I saw more value in books, in the fictional and non-fictional characters, than I did in most ponies around me, except for a select few. Nearly everything I know about the world around me, the ponies who live in it, and even myself, I've been taught by books. How to talk politely, how to act appropriately, and how to think intelligently.
She looked to see a bemused Silver looking at her.
But no book that I've ever read could have prepared me for this. I mean, sure, they may have touched on the subject of love a bit. You know, a few broken-hearted soliloquies here, a few princes rescuing the beautiful princess to live happily ever after there, but I've come to realize that, and it pains me to say it, books are a pale example of what love is. It scratches the surface, yes, but underneath that surface, there is an ocean of feeling that words can't hope to describe.
She looked down at her bowl of oatmeal and began to idly swirl the spoon around the bowl with the tip of a hoof, her eyes far away.
I remember reading once that love is a lot like falling into a raging waterfall. It's a powerful, unstoppable force that takes you along whether you like it or not. I don't think I agree with that, however.
She was silent for a moment, the only sound coming from the light clinking of the metal spoon against the porcelain bowl. She closed her eyes once more and smiled, more to herself than anything else.
I'd say it's more like turning your face upwards underneath gentle rain on a warm, quiet spring day. It falls over you, soaking you to the bone, but not in a bad way. It's nice. Like sitting next to a fireplace, washing away any aches and worries until you can't help but smile because of it. Everything wrong in the world just seems to disappear underneath the rain, and what's left is the most beautiful feeling you've ever felt.
Silverquill was stunned. Twilight stopped twirling the spoon with her hoof and opened her eyes to find him with his jaw open, staring at her in disbelief.
It's strange, and I'll admit, a little bit frightening feeling this way,
she said softly, holding her hoof up to her heart and sighing softly before dropping it.
Usually when I encounter something new and strange, I can just look it up in a book, but in this case, that's not an option. So I just have to go off of what I feel rather than what I think. Something I've never actually done before.
Silver blinked, his mouth closing with a snap. That sounded somewhat familiar. A small flame of hope ignited inside of him, but he didn't dare let it grow into anything more.
What I feel is odd. It's sort of a bittersweet feeling, and I don't know whether or not I should be incredibly happy or incredibly afraid.
She chuckled to herself and looked up at Silver, her eyes shining as she smiled at him.
I guess I feel a little bit of both.
They looked at each other for a good long while, eventually causing the mayor to blush slightly and look away once more.
Silver, I can't really say that I know exactly what love is, as I've never actually felt it before. But after what happened last night...
Her blush deepened.
I think that I can say that I understand it a little better now.
They were quiet for a moment, Silver mulling over what she had just said in his head while Twilight waited with red cheeks and a hesitant expression to see what he would say. Silver narrowed his eyes as he thought. So, what you're saying is... he said, his words trailing off as he tried to wrap his head around all of it.
That I love you, yes.
Twilight replied, somewhat irritably, somehow turning even redder than before. Silver blinked, the flame roaring to life instantaneously. He smiled at the blushing mare, mentally laughing at the way she seemed to be trying to hide her face from him, yet still watching him at the same time with an almost desperate look in her eyes. Well, couldn't you have just said that? Silver asked teasingly with a grin. Her eyes widened in shock.
What? I did!
She replied indignantly. In what has to be the most roundabout way ever, yes, he replied, his grin widening.
You little...
She stammered ungracefully.
Was that not good enough for you or something?
She demanded. I'm just saying. You were able to say it before, you should be able to say it today. Silver had to withhold a laugh when she sputtered indignantly.
But you... that was...
In the heat of the moment, Silver finished with a grin.
No!
She replied hotly before looking away.
Maybe...
Silver had to let out a chuckle at this point, which caused Twilight to groan and lay her head on the table dejectedly.
I take it all back,
she replied dejectedly.
I hate you now.
Silver laughed brightly, reaching over and running his hoof through her mane comfortingly. I love you too, Twilight, he replied fondly. This caused her ears to perk up slightly, and she looked up at him with a shy look, giving him a small smile and a laugh. Wordlessly, she straightened in her seat, and with one more fond look at Silverquill, she went back to her food, not saying anything more, as there was nothing else that needed to be said.